We must stand together.
The selection process had never failed. In 73 years of formal participation in the Galactic Cooperative Assembly, Earth had sent 7 representatives. 7 men and women chosen through a process so rigorous, so exhaustively designed, that the galactic community had come to regard it as one of the more interesting human institutions. A civilization young enough to still be uncertain of itself, careful enough to turn that uncertainty into a system. The process took 18 months. It involved every major government on Earth, 7 independent assessment bodies, a review panel that included 3 non-human observers from allied civilizations, and a final evaluation period during which the candidate lived and worked aboard a cooperative assembly station for 90 days before the appointment was confirmed. The 7 representatives who had emerged from this process had been, without exception, exceptional people. Scholars, diplomats, scientists, leaders who had spent decades building the kinds of careers that could survive the scrutiny of a galaxy that had been watching humanity with cautious, sometimes skeptical attention since first contact. The 8th representative was a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher from a small town in rural Indiana named Ruth Calloway. She had not applied. She did not, in fact, know she had been selected until a young man from the Office of Galactic Affairs knocked on her front door on a Wednesday morning in early October, while she was in the backyard trying to do something about the state of her tomato plants. The young man's name was Daniel Acaffer. He was 29, a junior attaché with 2 years of Galactic Affairs experience and the specific assignment, handed to him 40 minutes earlier by his supervisor, of traveling to Millhaven, Indiana, and informing Ruth Calloway that she had been selected as Earth's 8th representative to the Galactic Cooperative Assembly. His supervisor had not explained why Ruth Calloway had been selected. His supervisor had said only that the selection had come from the very top of the process, not the review panel, not the assessment bodies, but the small, quiet committee that sat above all of it and made final determinations when the normal system produced no clear answer, and that Daniel's job was to go there, explain the situation, and bring her back if she was willing. He had looked up Ruth Calloway on the transit to Indiana. She had taught 6th grade for 38 years at Millhaven Elementary School. She had been by all accounts a very good teacher. Former students had written about her in terms that suggested she had shaped certain people's lives in ways that quietly mattered, the kind of teacher who appeared in memoirs not as a dramatic figure, but as the person who had said one thing once at exactly the right moment. She had 2 children, 4 grandchildren. She had never held public office. She had never published academic work. She had never served in any capacity that appeared in the databases of organizations relevant to galactic affairs. She was, as far as Daniel could determine, entirely ordinary. He found her in the backyard, crouched beside a raised garden bed, wearing gardening gloves and a light jacket, frowning at a tomato plant in a way that suggested the plant had recently disappointed her. She looked up when she heard the gates. She had pale blue eyes and gray hair cut practically short, and the particular quality of stillness that some older people develop, not slowness, not absence, but the look of someone who has learned to let things settle before responding. "You're from the government," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Daniel Acaffer, Office of Galactic Affairs." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled off one gardening glove and held out her hand. "Ruth Calloway, come inside, I'll make coffee." She listened to the entire explanation without interrupting. Daniel had prepared carefully. He had the formal documentation. He had the summary of the selection process. He had a brief prepared for the specific purpose of explaining to a non-specialist what the Galactic Cooperative Assembly was and why Earth's representative position mattered. He had anticipated questions about logistics, about compensation, about what the role would actually require. Ruth Calloway waited until he had finished. Then she said, "Why me?" Daniel had been given an answer to this question. He delivered it. The selection committee had identified specific qualities that the current assembly required, qualities that the standard candidate pool had not produced in sufficient combination. And Ruth Calloway's profile had emerged from an extended search that had examined a much broader range of human experience than the traditional process typically considered. Ruth looked at him steadily. "That's the official answer," she said. "What's the real one?" Daniel paused. He was 29 and relatively new to this work, but he had already developed enough judgment to recognize when a question deserved more than the prepared response. "The assembly is in the middle of something difficult," he said. "There's a dispute, a significant one, between three of the major civilizations over resource access in a disputed sector. The negotiations have been stalled for 14 months. The previous attempts to resolve it have all failed, and the failure mode has been consistent. Both sides keep finding ways to make the other side feel diminished. Every skilled diplomat who's gone in there has made the same mistake, because they've all been trained in the same tradition. And that tradition, Earth's tradition of galactic diplomacy, has a specific blind spot." "What blind spot?" "We've learned over 70 years to match the other civilizations' level of formality, to meet them in their own register, to not seem less sophisticated, less experienced, less capable than they are. We've become very good at performing credibility." He paused. "The problem is that what's needed in that room right now isn't credibility. It's something that's harder to perform." Ruth waited. "Disarming honesty," Daniel said. "Someone who can walk into that room and have no investment in being impressive. Someone who has nothing to prove and knows it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Oh, you need someone who won't be caught trying," she said. "Oh, yes." She looked out the window at the backyard, at the tomato plants. "I don't speak any galactic languages," she said. "We have translators. I've never been off-planet. We have a preparation program, 6 weeks. I'm 71 years old. As I know." She turned back to him. Her expression had not changed, still that quality of settled attention, things landing and finding their place. "When do we leave?" she said. The 6 weeks of preparation were not what Ruth had expected. She had expected to be taught things, protocols, histories, the elaborate social structures and honorific systems and diplomatic conventions that 70 years of galactic contact had produced. She had expected to spend 6 weeks trying to absorb an amount of information that would take a professional diplomat years to develop, and she had expected to feel, most of the time, inadequate. Some of that happened. She did learn protocols. She did learn histories. She sat through briefings that covered everything from the specific territorial grievance at the center of the current dispute to the cultural context of each of the three civilizations involved, and the briefings were delivered by people who knew their material and delivered it clearly. But the preparation team, a small, serious group who had clearly been thinking carefully about what Ruth specifically needed, spent as much time on something else. They spent time helping her understand what she already knew that mattered. The lead preparation officer was a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who had spent 15 years working on cross-civilizational communication, and who had been, Daniel understood, one of the quiet advocates for Ruth's selection. Dr. Anand was precise and direct and had a quality of attention that reminded Ruth, oddly, of certain students she had taught over the years, the ones who were so genuinely curious that you could feel it in the quality of their listening. "Tell me about a conflict," Dr. Anand said on the third day. "A real one between people you knew, something that seemed stuck." Ruth thought about it. She told her about a situation from her second year of teaching two families in the school community, a dispute over something that had started small and calcified over the course of a school year into something that was poisoning the classroom, affecting the children, making everyone miserable. The principal had tried to mediate. The school counselor had tried. Both attempts had made things worse in the specific way that formal interventions often made things worse, because the families had interpreted the formality as taking sides. Ruth had resolved it by inviting both mothers to help her set up a classroom display, not to talk about the dispute, to do something together, something ordinary, something where they were both just people doing a task rather than parties in a conflict. It had worked, not immediately, not cleanly, but it had worked. Dr. Anand listened to all of it. Then she said, "That is the skill set we are sending you in with. That and the fact that you are genuinely not afraid of these beings." Ruth had considered this. "I'm not afraid of them," she agreed. "I'm a little afraid of the spaceship, honestly." "That's fine," Dr. Anand said. "Fear of spaceships is reasonable." The Galactic Cooperative Assembly Station was very large and not very welcoming, in the way that large institutional spaces are often not welcoming, designed for function and capacity rather than for making individuals feel at ease. Ruth looked at it through the viewport of the transport and thought that it reminded her somewhat of the county courthouse in Millhaven, built in 1923 in a style that communicated authority and had no particular interest in also communicating warmth. Daniel accompanied her through the arrival procedures, which were extensive. Other delegations moved through the common areas, some familiar in shape, some not, some in environmental suits that indicated bodies designed for very different atmospheres. Ruth observed all of it with the careful, undemonstrative attention she had developed over decades of classrooms, where the ability to notice things without visibly noticing them had been one of the most useful tools she possessed. The three parties to the dispute were the Mhareth sovereignty, the Andari coalition, and a smaller civilization called the Pelith, who had the misfortune of being geographically between the other two, and claiming the same resource-rich sector that both of the larger powers also claimed. The previous 14 months of failed negotiation had produced a situation in which the Mhareth and Andari had stopped speaking to each other directly and were communicating exclusively through formal written instruments, a method that had the advantage of precision and the disadvantage of removing every human element from the exchange. The Pelith caught between them had been growing quieter and more careful with every failed session. The particular quiet of a small party that has realized it is not, in the end, the principal subject of the dispute. Ruth read the briefing documents on the dispute 3 more times the evening before her first session. She read the history. She read the transcripts of the failed negotiations, all 14 months of them. Then she put the documents down and thought about what she had read. What she thought was this: the Mhareth and the Andari were not at their core in conflict about the resource sector. The resource sector was real and the competing claims were real and the economic stakes were real. But 14 months of failed negotiation had turned the dispute into something else as well. It had become a test. Each side was watching to see whether the other would, under pressure, reveal the thing they already suspected, that the other civilization did not regard them as equals. That the formality, the treaties, the centuries of cooperative assembly membership were a surface beneath which the real dynamic was something older and less civil. Every skilled diplomat who had entered that room had, without meaning to, confirmed that suspicion. Because skilled diplomats performed credibility, and performing credibility in a room full of beings who were watching for condescension looked a great deal like condescension. Ruth thought about the two mothers and the classroom display. Then she went to sleep. The first session began at what the station's systems designated as morning, and Ruth arrived slightly early and sat down at Earth's designated position and looked around the chamber. The Mhareth delegation was already present, 5 of them tall and angular in formal attire that communicated serious institutional weight. They had not looked at her when she came in. Ruth did not interpret this as hostility. In her experience, people who were in the middle of something painful and difficult often used not looking as a management strategy. The Andari arrived next. 6 delegates in their distinctive environmental suits, moving with the slightly deliberate quality that the suits required. They glanced at the Mharith. The Mharith did not glance back. The Pelith came last, 3 of them small relative to the other delegations. They sat down quietly. The session chair, a Verath official named Provisional Arbiter Thesavane, opened the session with the standard procedural language and then invited Earth's representative to make an opening statement. Ruth had prepared a statement. It was a good statement. Dr. Anand had helped her with it, and Daniel had reviewed it, and it was appropriate and respectful and accurately positioned Earth's role as a neutral facilitating party. Oh, she did not use it. She looked at the chamber, at the Mharith who were not looking at her, at the Andari contained in their suits and their careful posture, at the Pelith quiet and watchful. She said, I want to tell you something about why I'm here instead of someone else. The chamber was quiet. Earth usually sends diplomats to these sessions. Experienced people who know your languages and your histories and your protocols. I am not that. I am a retired school teacher from a small town in Indiana. I taught 11-year-olds for 38 years. I know how to read when a room has stopped trying to solve the problem and started trying to win the argument instead, because I have seen it in classrooms, and I have seen it in parent meetings, and I have seen it in faculty rooms where the adults were supposed to know better. And I am looking at this room right now, and what I see is a room that has stopped trying to solve the problem. She paused. I am not going to tell you how to solve it. I don't know how to solve it. I have read 14 months of transcripts and I understand what the disagreement is about, and I understand that all 3 of the positions in this room have legitimacy. What I want to do, if you'll allow me, is ask some questions. Not formal questions for the record, just questions. The kind I used to ask in my classroom when the answer everyone was giving was clearly not the real answer. The Mharith delegate, who appeared to be the senior member of the delegation, Ruth had learned his name, Counselor Veth M. Harron, and that he had been part of every failed session, looked at her for the first time. You are very direct, he said. His translator rendered the words in a tone that was not quite accusation and not quite approval. I am 71 years old, Ruth said. I don't have a lot of time for indirect. Something crossed Counselor M. Harron's face that the translator could not render. Ruth filed it carefully. I ask your questions, he said. She asked them over 3 days. They were not diplomatic questions. They were not questions designed to surface positions or test the limits of compromise or identify the zone of possible agreement. They were simpler than that and harder than that, the kind of questions that a person could only ask without flinching if they genuinely did not have a stake in the answer looking a particular way. She asked Counselor M. Harron what the resource sector meant to his civilization beyond its economic value. What it would mean, not for Mharith infrastructure or Mharith supply chains, but for Mharith people if this dispute was resolved in their favor, and what they feared it would mean if it was not. She asked the same questions of the Andari delegation lead, a careful and intelligent being named Senior Advocate Durith, who answered more slowly than M. Harron and with more precision, and whose answers, Ruth noticed, described fears that were not entirely different from the ones M. Harron had described, rendered in a completely different vocabulary. She asked the Pelith delegates, gently, because she had understood from the transcripts that 14 months of being the smallest party in a dispute between 2 larger ones had cost them something. What they would need, at minimum, to feel that their interests had been genuinely considered rather than managed. The Pelith delegate who answered was a young being, young by what Ruth had learned of their civilization, and when she answered, she looked directly at Ruth in a way that the other delegates had not, and what she said was, "We need to not be invisible." Ruth said, "I know what that feels like." The chamber was quiet. "Not personally," Ruth clarified, "but I have watched people feel it. I have watched children feel it. It changes everything about how they behave in a room when they believe that the room is not really about them. They stop saying what they actually think. They start saying what they believe will keep them safe." She paused. "You've all been doing that, all three of you, for 14 months. Counselor M. Heron said very quietly, "Yes." What happened next was not a miracle. Ruth had spent 38 years in classrooms, and she had a complete absence of belief in miracles. What happened was slower and harder and more human than a miracle, which is to say it was imperfect and required patience, and involved several moments of genuine setback before it found its footing. But it moved. The movement began specifically with a conversation that happened outside the formal session, in one of the station's common areas which Ruth had suggested after the second day. Not a formal meeting, not a session of record, just the three senior delegates and Ruth in a room with chairs and a table and the kind of ambient noise that large stations generate, mechanical and neutral, not quite silence and no agenda except talking. M. Heron and Durith had not been in the same room without a formal session structure between them in 14 months. Ruth watched them navigate this. She watched them make small miscalculations and correct them. She watched them discover slowly that the other party was doing the same thing, that the formality, which each had interpreted as the other's hostility, was in fact the same protective strategy they themselves were using. She said very little during this conversation. She asked a question here and there. She made one observation about what she was seeing directly and simply, and she watched it land. By the end of the third informal session, the Harith and Andari delegations were speaking to each other without formal instruments for the first time in over a year. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly, in the way that people speak when they have stopped performing and started cautiously to actua. Azali communicates. The Pelith delegate, whose name Ruth had learned was Advocate CL, had begun to contribute to the conversation without waiting to be explicitly invited. This was, Ruth recognized, significant. The formal sessions continued in parallel. The mechanism of resolution, when it came, was a shared administrative arrangement over the contested sector, not a clean division, not a victory for any single party, but a structure that all three could live with because it had been built from what each had said they actually needed, rather than what they had initially claimed they required. The agreement was initialed on the 19th day of Ruth's appointment. She was in the common area when the news moved through the station, drinking what the station's systems produced when you asked for tea, not quite right, but not bad, and reading a message from her daughter. Daniel found her there. He sat down across from her and looked at her with an expression that she had learned to recognize over 19 days, which was his expression for things he could not quite find the words for. 14 months, he said, 3 failed mediation attempts by some of the best diplomatic minds in the galactic community. 19 days. Ruth looked at her tea. "I didn't do anything they couldn't have done," she said. "They didn't do it. They were trying too hard." She set the tea down. "When you want something from a room very much, when you need to be seen as capable, as credible, as belonging there, the room can feel it. And the room becomes about that, about whether you belong there instead of about the problem. I didn't need to belong there. I already belonged somewhere else. I was just visiting." Daniel considered this. "You should teach this." "I did teach it," she said, "for 38 years. Nobody sent someone to put me in front of a galactic dispute about it." She smiled, he smiled back. The formal appointment as Earth's 8th representative ran for 2 years. Ruth served for all of it, returning to Millhaven between sessions, tending her garden and seeing her grandchildren and answering, occasionally, the messages from former students that had begun arriving after the story of the 19th day resolution became known. Not widely known, not publicly known, the details of assembly proceedings were not broadcast, but known enough in enough of the right places. That people who had spent years in Ruth's classroom understood that something had happened and sent notes saying, without entirely knowing why, that it did not surprise them. Her daughter asked her once during one of her visits home what it had been like, what the assembly was like, what the other civilizations were like. Ruth thought about it for a while. "They're very old," she said finally. "Most of them. Their civilizations have been doing this, the cooperation, the negotiation, all of it, for much longer than we have, and they're very good at it. The systems they've built, the ways they've learned to talk to each other, it's remarkable, really." But her daughter said, Ruth looked at the backyard, at the garden, at the tomato plants which had recovered considerably since October. "They forget what it's like to not know," she said. "When you've been doing something for long enough, the uncertainty goes away. And the uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's also honest. It keeps you paying attention to the actual situation instead of the version of the situation that fits your framework." She paused. "I didn't know anything about what I was walking into, and that turned out to be the most useful thing I had." Her daughter was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like something you'd have said to your students," she said. "I probably did say it to my students, several times." Ruth stood up and picked up her gardening gloves. "Most things that are true in a classroom are also true in a galaxy. I think that was the actual lesson." The letter arrived 6 months after her appointment ended. It was from Advocate CL of the Pelith delegation. Ruth had not expected to hear from her. The resolution had been final and the parties had moved on, as parties do, into the ordinary ongoing work of implementing agreements and managing the frictions that always appeared in implementation. The letter was short. It said that CL had gone back to her homeworld after the resolution and had spent some months thinking about the 19 days and about what had shifted, and she had been trying to understand it. She had asked others. She had consulted people who had been in the chamber. She had read Ruth's file, or the portions of it that were accessible, and she had found it. And CL wrote this in terms that Ruth suspected were more direct than the diplomatic conventions of Pelith formal writing usually permitted, confusing, in an interesting way. "You had no particular preparation for this," CL wrote. "You had no experience in these chambers. You had no training in the specific traditions and histories and protocols that the rest of us had been working with for years. What you had was a quality of attention that none of us had brought to those sessions. You saw us, not our positions, not our interests in the formal sense. Us, the actual beings in the room and what we were each afraid of and what we actually needed. I have been trying to understand how you did that, and the only answer I have found is that you were not trying to do anything else at the same time." Ruth read the letter twice. Then she set it on her desk next to her gardening gloves in the small room where she kept the things that mattered. She wrote back. She said that she was glad the resolution had held, and that she thought about the 3 delegations sometimes, and that she hoped the implementation was going well. She said that what CL had described, seeing the actual beings in the room, was something she had learned from children, who were very bad at hiding what they actually needed and therefore very good at teaching you to look for it. She said one more thing. She said that in 38 years of classrooms, the children who had taught her the most were the ones who had trusted her enough to show her what they were struggling with, even when they weren't sure she'd know what to do about it. And that she didn't know if the analogy translated, but that she had felt in that chamber something she recognized. People who were struggling and had decided cautiously to show it. "That is the only thing I did," she wrote. "I made it safe enough to be honest. Everything else you did yourselves." She was back in Millhaven when the announcement came that the Cooperative Assembly had formally requested Earth begin considering its 9th representative selection. The standard procedure, a decade had passed. The process would begin. She was in the garden when Daniel called, which was where she usually was when calls came. Because the garden required steady hands and steady attention, and both of those were useful things to be practicing. They're asking, he said, whether you have any recommendations. Ruth looked at her tomato plants. They were doing very well this year. Tell them the same thing I'd tell anyone looking for good people, she said. Don't look for the most impressive person. Look for the most honest one. Look for someone who genuinely doesn't need the room to be about them. She paused. And if they're having trouble finding that, they're probably looking in the wrong places. Where are the right places? Daniel asked. Ruth thought about 38 years, about classrooms and parent meetings and faculty rooms, and the particular skill of watching a room closely enough to see what it needed before anyone said a word. Everywhere, she said, that quality is everywhere. It just doesn't usually show up in the places people think to look. She ended the call and put her phone in her jacket pocket and went back to her garden in the clear October light, with the serious and patient attention that she had always given to things that were worth tending.